There's another Tom Paine in the room, and that's Joseph Blasi, who's our keynoter today. Joseph actually tells me that he's actually a kind of an introspective, not an extroverted kind of guy. He's a researcher, and he likes to curl up with his computer and books and things, and write books, and he's done many of those. But he's had to kind of come out of his shell a little bit and become a more public person because of this great new book that he's written. So, his biography. Oh yes, I have to tell you that he's in the public eye so much these days that he actually was invited to be on Fox Business News the other day. And I really should send you the clip, because they ganged up on him and they beat him up. It was really terrible. They treated him very badly. But he came through and he got his message through, and he's really getting quite thick-skinned, I have to say. So hats off to you, Joseph. So Joseph Blasi is a professor and sociologist at the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University, where he teaches courses on corporate governance. He's also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He's written many articles and 13 books, many of them on employee ownership, including In the Company of Owners from 2003 and Shared Capitalism at Work. His latest book, The Citizen's Share, is like those other two, co-authored with a couple of other people. So Joseph actually practices collaboration in his own work. This book, The Citizen's Share, which was published just last year by Yale University Press and is about to come out in paperback, it's been quite successful, makes the case that the founders of this country, as he's going to tell us, saw ownership of productive assets, not just stationary land, productive land that could be used for farming, but the whole vision of every citizen having a stake was an absolutely essential part of that American vision. So it's an important point to remind policyholders, policymakers, and to interject into our politics. And I'm hoping that Joseph can be a well-known Tom Paine for our movement. So welcome, Joseph.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And I just want to salute the Vermont Employee Ownership Center and Don and the board and all of you. You're up here in Vermont, but you might not realize that you are the leaders in the country in establishing a really active state center and establishing a really important nodule of employee ownership. And there are going to be a lot of states and a lot of regions that want to imitate your success. So I know we all spend a lot of days looking at our own belly buttons and looking in our own rooms and our own houses and companies, but what you are doing is very important to the whole nation, and I hope that you realize that. So here's to you. I usually spend most of my time doing statistical analyses of databases and financial comparisons of employee ownership and non-employee ownership firms. Oh, there's Fox again. Today I want to do something else, which is take you on a big tour, or actually a little tour of American history, and try to show you that what you're doing is actually deeply based in several hundred years of American history. I want to offer a few blue hors d'oeuvres from the book, a few stories. I also want to say a few difficult things, speak maybe a little truth to power about some unfortunate events in American history and things that are happening right now that undercut and undermine broad-based ownership. But the main point I want to make is that there is a really big idea in American history, and all of you here in Vermont are advancing that idea. And so I want to request that you put your individual actions and thoughts and companies and efforts in the context of this big idea, because then Vermont can have a really huge effect going forward. I will at the end articulate what I hope is a nonpartisan vision for political change in this area. So we'll start with this fish. How many people know what kind of fish this is? Okay, this is the codfish, and there's a much bigger codfish. When the sailors came over early on to the colonies, they found off the coast of New England codfish just teeming all over the place, practically jumping in the boats up towards Nova Scotia. And you should know that at the time of the American Revolution, that the cod fishery was actually one of the few global commodities. This is really interesting. Yes, dried codfish in barrels had a global commodity price, and they were traded. Why? Because the Pope said that you couldn't have meat on Friday, and so there was a huge market for barrels of dried codfish throughout Europe. And in fact, for the American colonies, it was the 4th largest export, so very important to their economic development. So if you were a feudal power that wanted to take over a colony, what would you do with their 4th largest export? Well, this is exactly what the British did during the American Revolution. They destroyed the cod ships, they destroyed the ports, they destroyed the warehouses, they arrested the sailors because they wanted to punish the colonies and make sure that they could vanquish and eliminate their 4th largest export. And if the colonies did win the war, one of the biggest supporters of their treasury would be gone. George Washington, just when he became first president of the United States, took a tour of the country, and he stopped by Marblehead, Massachusetts, and he met with many of the cod fishermen, and he also met with some of the investors who invested in cod ships. And they told him that it was very important to bring back this, this industry. So Washington called Thomas Jefferson back from Paris. Jefferson, as you know, was ambassador to Paris, and asked him to put together a plan to bring the cod fishery back. And Jefferson did a lot of research on this. He got a research assistant who was the assistant secretary of the Treasury, and he asked him, find out what you can about the cod fishery, please. So this assistant secretary of the Treasury went to the leading shipper in Philadelphia. His name was Joseph Anthony. This was a very rich guy. He was the leading shipper in Philadelphia. He was very wealthy and very influential with the government. And Joseph Anthony reported back to Jefferson the following. He said, the captain and the crew drew one half and agreed among themselves in what proportion to divide the fare. Sometimes the owners hired the men by the month and give them common seamen's wages, but they were generally found the most attentive when their dependence was on a share of what they caught. So here we have the richest shipper in Philadelphia saying the ships that had profit sharing were more productive. As far as I know, this is the first American research on shares. And if you go into Thomas Jefferson's papers, you will see that in Jefferson's report on the American fisheries, he puts this evidence from Joseph Anthony right there up front. The letter is right there up front. And so, in fact, for several hundred years, the cod fishery in this part of the country before the American Revolution did have widespread profit sharing on the entire catch. It was just a part of the cod fishery and the way it functioned. So Jefferson had an idea. He wanted to try to bring the cod fishery back, and he had to present a bill to Congress. But Jefferson was against subsidizing the industry. But he thought, how can we do this? Well, he realized that because we had tariffs, which you know are essentially taxes, the cod fishermen and the shippers who owned the cod ships, they paid a lot of taxes on the supplies that were brought in from outside of the United States. And Jefferson's idea was to give a tax cut to ships that went out to fish for cod. And the tax cut would be larger for the ships as their size would increase. Okay? And so on February 16, 1792, and it is 1792, President George Washington signed his first piece of legislation on business economic development and to stimulate growth of the cod fishery. And what it said is that cod ships, the owners, the captain, and the crew had to sign a contract before a ship went out saying that they would have broad-based profit sharing on that ship. And then they would be able to get a tax credit. And the tax credit would go 5/8 to the crew and 3/8 to the owners of the ship. Okay, very similar to the kind of way that ERISA divides up shares in ESOPs, for example. Because we didn't have tax forms at the day, there was no way for someone to sort of submit their tax form to Washington and get a check in the mail. So Secretary of Treasury Alexander Hamilton had to pay these tax credits from the customs houses. And all of us who've traveled along the Atlantic seacoast, we know where the customs houses are. They're that big granite building on the coast of the Atlantic. And so Alexander Hamilton would pay the credits. So here we have the first business piece of legislation signed by President Washington doing two things, saying that the tax credits would be shared between the crew and the owners of the ship, and the condition for receiving the tax credits would be having broad-based profit sharing on the whole catch. And for those of you who are interested in law, it was very interesting when I was researching this at the National Archives, and I'll talk about the National Archives in just a minute, that a lot of the early court cases in American history had to do with little kinds of conflicts between the crew and the captain over these shares. So for example, I was on a cod fishing expedition, but I got off the ship early. How much of a share should I get? Well, we have a little court case on that. So profit sharing created a whole legal cottage industry. And there we have the young Thomas Jefferson. Now, the reason why I put this picture of National Treasure up here is because when I was doing this research, I said to myself, this is an incredible story. And I had discovered this story when I was with my wife and son in an old sea captain's cottage up in Maine, and I was reading through his library. So I said, if this story is really true, I have to go down to the National Archives and find Alexander Hamilton's record books and see if he actually was paying out money from the U.S. Treasury to the customs houses. So I go down to the National Archives, and I go into the reading room. I tell them, well, I'm a professor, I'm writing this book, I'm interested in this, and I'd like to see copies of Alexander Hamilton's record books. Well, the guy goes upstairs into the safe, and he brings down the actual record book of Alexander Hamilton, not a microfilm, not a copy. And so I said, my God, here I am. I'm sitting here with the actual record book of Alexander Hamilton. So I start looking through, and there it is. He's approving all these payments to all the customs houses for the cod fishery based on these shares. And I see a Xerox machine. I run over to the Xerox machine, put them out, start Xeroxing copies. All of a sudden, I look up, and there's several guys in black coats standing around me. Yes, I've been made by the security staff of the National Archives. And so they said, you can't have this book, you can't be in here, immediately give us the book. And so I hardly got out of there with my pride and my freedom intact. But this goes to a larger idea that in fact, all of the founders of American history, whether it's Washington, here we have John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton himself, James Madison, all believed from their reading of political philosophy, and we know they had their terrible limitations at their time, some of them, the horrible evil of slavery and the horrible exclusion of women from civil society. But they were reading political philosophy, and all of them recognized one thing, that you could not have a representative republic without having broad-based property ownership. A lot of political philosophers have talked about this idea. And in chapter 1 of the book, I take you through all of their writings, all of what they read, and show you that this was really something that they believed in very, very strongly. In fact, John Adams, before the American Revolution, worked very hard to make sure that public land in Massachusetts would be easily and cheaply distributed to individual families, so they would have enough property ownership to have economic liberty. I know it sounds like a Tea Party argument, because it isn't, in a way, kind of a nonpartisan argument. And their notion was really interesting. There were two parts of their notion. One part of their notion was that individuals needed to have enough economic liberty and property ownership to support themselves so they wouldn't be dependent on someone else. That was necessary for democracy. And then the other part of their argument was that if a lot of individuals had broad-based property ownership, well then you would have a democracy that would be controlled by a broad group of individuals. In fact, when John Adams drafted, and he did draft, the Massachusetts Constitution after the Revolution, in the discussion there in Boston, they actually were thinking of changing the name of Massachusetts to Oceana. So, how many people recognize what Oceana is? Oceana was the name of an imaginary political tract written by James Harrington, in which he talked about a country where you had broad-based property ownership. And so they were so into this idea of broad-based property ownership, they actually debated, at the time they were debating the Massachusetts Constitution, changing the name of Massachusetts to Oceana. So this was not some kind of a small side idea. The founders believed in shares. George Washington wrote, if America will not be less advantageous to the lowest class of people because of the equal distribution of property. And what they were thinking about is their notion that there would be a lot of equality, not absolute equality, but broad-based property ownership, and we would have a really large middle class. John Adams, as I said, pushed property access in Massachusetts. In fact, he wrote, the only possible way of preserving equal liberty is to make the acquisition of land easy to every member of society. And Jefferson's famous quote, his most famous quote on this, that legislators cannot invent too many devices for subdividing property. Now, he wasn't talking about redistribution, he was talking about giving people access and the ability to acquire property. Now, President James Madison designed some criteria for making sure we would continue to have broad-based property ownership in the United States. And he wrote, the U.S. have a precious advantage in the actual distribution of property and the universal hope of acquiring property. Now, we fast forward a bit to May 20th, 1862, after a lot of tragic events and a lot of confrontation of terrible compromises. And we see, and here's the 100-year anniversary stamp of the Homestead Act, we see Abraham Lincoln, who's given several speeches, again bringing up this idea of broad-based property ownership necessary for democracy. Some historians have claimed that after the first few decades of American history that this idea kind of passed. It didn't pass. Lincoln was well aware of it. In fact, you need to know that throughout the 1800s, the most popular policy in the United States, other than free postage, was the idea of a homestead for every citizen, for every family. And the Homestead Act really created something similar to the ESOP, leverage to secure capital assets. It's important to understand that the founders and Lincoln didn't just see this as something they would just talk about. They actually did really big things. So let's look at the Homestead Act as an example. The Homestead Act put at the disposal of citizens to get big amounts of farmland 20% of all public land. This is not something minor. This is not some minor tax incentive. And 10% of the entire landmass of the country. So many of us know of the Homestead Act. Citizens could get 160 acres and up, and they had to put in some sweat equity. Later on, it became possible to buy land in installments with some government credit, very similar to the ESOP idea. And one of the most wonderful things is 20% of homesteaders were women. Okay, so finally, the Homestead Act, even before women got the right to vote, opens up the access of women to economic development. We have a national historic site devoted to women homesteaders. You should think of visiting it. And finally, eventually, the Homestead Act successors of the Homestead Act opened up the Homestead idea to African Americans. There were an explosion of state laws dealing with homesteading. There in red you see the amount of the U.S. affected by the Homestead Act. Now, as I said, big share policies were the norm. A lot of states, such as Massachusetts, had policies to provide public land to individual citizens. The Northeast Ordinance of 1787 took what would be 5 northern states and abolished servitude in 1787 and said, here's a lot of land that citizens could cheaply acquire. Jefferson said he did the Louisiana Purchase. He bought 1 million acres from Napoleon in order to create an empire of liberty, to extend this idea of citizens having individual land ownership. And for 100 years, there was a policy of cheap, similar to ESOP, tax-credited ability for citizens to buy land. In fact, you need to know that the petition drive for the Homestead Act and the foundation of the Republican Party were very much involved with this idea of the Homestead Act. And there you see in green the Northwest Ordinance Territory, in green the Louisiana Purchase. But there was a dilemma of landed independence, and it brought up some of the deepest conflicts in American history. There was a terrible injustice to Native Americans in some of these lands that were made available. And Madison also realized that eventually the country would run out of land. So this vision that you would just divide up all the land among citizens would be not realizable. You would take an envelope, as Madison did in 1830, and divide. He thought, well, let's see, well, how much land will there be? He took the amount of land. How many citizens will there be in 1930? He took that, and he divided one by the other, and he realized people won't have enough land. It just won't work. And so he wrote, something has to be done. We have to figure out a way to deal with this. And he said, if we don't figure out a way to deal with this, there will be such wealth inequality that we will need to use the militia to maintain control. Now fast forward the tape, when all those terrible strikes about economic injustice happened in the mid-1800s, you know what started happening? And you have also seen them like you've seen the customs houses. We started building armories in major cities around the United States. So Madison was predicting something. But it was this fellow, the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Representative Galusha Grow, Republican of Lancaster, anti-slavery, interested in economic justice. Galusha Grow managed the Homestead Act through the U.S. Congress for President Abraham Lincoln. And Galusha Grow talked about you, because Galusha Grow said, we've run out of land, and the future of this idea is in shares in corporations and in businesses. The future of this idea is in shares. Maybe time to give a small and a large salute to Louis Kelso, the inventor of the ESOP. We have a lot of types of worker ownership, co-ops, ESOP. What I think the ESOP contributes, and Kelso's great idea, is the notion that you don't have to start a company with your savings, but you can borrow capital. A workers' trust can borrow capital, and with some tax incentives can establish capital ownership for workers without the risk of worker savings. I think it's a very important idea for us to keep in mind. But here we are, 2014, and where do we find ourselves? In 2014, we find ourselves very close to the English feudalism that the American founders were trying to rebel against. Here you have on top the king, and on the bottom all of the peasants and serfs. At the time of the American Revolution, 80% of English land was controlled by a very small aristocracy. Well, let's look at some of the numbers today. How close are we coming to the 80% figure? 50% of wealth owned by the top 5%. 75% of wealth owned by the top 10%. 80%, oh, we're at the English feudalism number already, of financial assets owned by the top 10%. 90% of corporate stock owned by the top 10%. 57% of all capital gains and all capital income concentrated in just the top 1%. The top 20% in the United States have over 80% of all capital gains and income. And most income growth from 1993 to 2010 has been in the top 1%. So really my message today, there you can see 86% of all capital gains and all capital income in the United States in the top 20%. My goal today is to make this point that we have finally reached a level of concentration of wealth very similar to English feudalism, and the idea that many of the founders had, that broad-based property ownership is necessary for a representative republic to exist, is ever more a fresh idea today as it was then. And so what you are doing, I think, should be seen in this context. You're not just starting firms, you're not just transitioning from one firm to another, you're not just figuring out your problems in your little room or your big problems with your customer base. You are working on an American dream, an American vision, which was viewed as central to democracy. And if there is any solution to the idea of wealth inequality in the United States, it is what you're doing. As Madison said during the American Constitutional Convention, if we don't have broad-based property ownership, what we're going to have in a majority democratic regime is the majority is going to vote to increase taxes, to have redistribution, that kind of stuff. Many of you have read about the book, famous bestseller of the New York Times now, Capital of the 21st Century by French economist Thomas Piketty. He was on Stephen Colbert last night. I don't know how many people saw Thomas on Stephen Colbert last night. My son did. The younger generation, that's all they watch. They don't watch network news anymore. Professor Piketty has articulated this notion that when we get wealth inequality at these levels, there's going to be calls for a wealth tax as a solution. My book talks about the importance of the share idea and the share solution in American history to this idea of wealth inequality. So I want to mention a little teaser. I do not ignore American history from the Homestead Act to 2014. And in Chapter 4, I talk a lot about, because you might wonder, where did all these ideas, the ESOP and broad-based stock options and co-ops, where did they all come from? Did they just fall from the sky in American history? And in Chapter 4, I talk a lot about that, how unions had a very important role in developing the idea of worker co-ops, and how many American industrialists who you wouldn't suspect had a very important role in broad-based employee ownership. And here we have George Eastman on the cover of Time magazine. Eastman was a devout Republican, and here's his library of books on English socialism and worker co-ops. And Eastman, when he developed the camera, he said he wanted to have a different kind of company at Kodak. And Kodak, which was the Google of its time, had broad-based employee ownership, broad-based profit sharing, and Eastman probably is the guy who invented broad-based stock options that we see being used in Google today. So the question now that I want to end with is, so what do we do? What do we do now? So there's one conclusion from this history. Because you cannot have a democracy without broad-based property ownership, then it is the priority of the government to encourage broad-based property ownership. All those maps that I showed you of those big chunks of public land that the founders thought should be divided up for family farms so they could have economic liberty, that was to establish the point that they were in favor of the government using tax incentives to support broad-based property ownership. So I'm going to tell you in a moment about some really big things that I think we can do on par with the big things that they have done. And I want to emphasize something to you, because we've gotten used in the worker ownership community to thinking of ourselves as the little remnant, the little engine that, well, maybe could, but it's not the big engine steaming down the tracks. What I want to emphasize to you today, and I'm going to try to prove that, is that the reason why we don't have more broad-based property ownership in the United States is because our political system has lost its way not because it's not possible. You are proof that it's possible. The 10,000 ESOP and ESOP-like firms and worker co-ops with over 10 million workers in the United States is proof that it is possible. So now let's talk about some hard things, some new ideas, and some difficult issues in American history. But first I want to tell you about something that I hope you don't know about because it's so boring, which is Internal Revenue Code 162M. I'm sure we have a bunch of lawyers in the room who know a lot about this. You should know that during the Clinton administration, those of us who remember Clinton's campaign, remember that little book called Putting People First by Bill Clinton and Al Gore. And in that book they wrote that they were against excessive executive pay and they wanted to limit the tax deduction for stock market companies to $1 million for their executive pay. And this was a major part of their platform in the early 1990s. Well, this, when President Clinton was elected, eventually became Internal Revenue Code 162M. And it said, we will, and I'll get to the good point in a second, it said we will limit the deductions that corporations can have on their salary for top 5 executives to $1 million, but all performance-based pay, like stock options, restricted stock grants, essentially employee ownership and profit sharing and gain sharing for the top 5 executives would have, I'm glad you're sitting down, unlimited deductions, okay? So if you have an ESOP, you can deduct, I don't know, somewhere between $40,000 and $80,000 a year for one worker, right? But if an executive of a top, one of the 5,000 stock market companies gets, $100 million in stock options, the whole thing is deducted. Does that sound to you like the policy the founders were talking about? No. It's a corruption of the American idea. But I have more to say to you. Do you know that since the first Clinton administration, the cost of the deductions for stock market companies for concentrated employee ownership, concentrated profit sharing, has been between $5 and $10 billion a year. In other words, you are subsidizing through this, because of the deductions, every piece of employee stock ownership or profit sharing, but only for a very small slice of people at the top of the American economic hierarchy. How much is the amount of money in tax expenditures for ESOPs every year in the United States? About $1 billion. How much was used for these tax expenditures for 162M in the last 20 years since 1993? I estimate between $200 and $400 billion. In other words, half or equal to the cost of both the Iraq and the Afghanistan wars. Okay? So this is outrageous. It's a shame. So what should our policy be? First, all business tax incentives, and let's go back to the Cod story, require having broad-based share plans. Companies, you can pay your executives whatever you want, free market economy. But if you want a tax incentive that's paid for by us, the citizens of the United States, then that tax incentive needs to benefit all the citizens of the United States, just like ERISA does. ERISA says you get the tax deduction for retirement plans, you include a lot of people in your plans. Notice, it's the same idea that Washington implemented with the Cod story. I'd like to see a major initiative to tie municipal and state tax incentives to shares and provide state capital tax incentives for sales to employee manager trusts and worker co-ops. We've introduced legislation in New Jersey, introduced by the Deputy Speaker of our legislature, to excuse from all capital gains taxes of family businesses, small businesses who sell their companies to worker co-ops or ESOPs. We need to redesign broad-based stock options as longer-term instruments and provide them with tax credits. This is an important moment for worker co-ops. It's a very important moment for worker co-ops to expand beyond retailing, to use worker co-ops to transform and acquire existing firms, and to create some kind of a combination of the co-op and the ESOP idea, which takes the ability to borrow capital and do big, expensive amounts of worker equity and combine that with the participation and democracy of worker co-ops. I want to endorse Senator Sanders' legislation, another piece of evidence, in addition to your efforts, that Vermont is in the vanguard of leadership in this area. Senator Sanders' legislation creating a federal bank to help with the development of and creation of employee-owned companies, and to allow for the development of state centers like the Leading Edge Vermont Center. Now you might say about the Sanders legislation, why do we need this? Well, let me just tell you something. We have a young economics student from the University of North Carolina who just did an analysis of how much employee ownership is in every county of the United States. Really fine-tuned analysis using census data. Do you know that half of the counties of the United States don't have any employee ownership? So the Sanders legislation is very important to provide the infrastructure in states to get out to those other half of the counties and to provide demonstration examples of financing. How did we run out of big ideas? How did we get so far from the central idea of America's founders? It's really unfortunate. But I think that by working with business leaders to invent new approaches to shares, and by teaching this idea in colleges and high schools, we can keep a new sense of innovation about broad-based property ownership going in America. Finally, what is the last big idea, in my view, for Vermont? You have a lot of employee-owned firms in Vermont. Why not establish a federation of these employee-owned firms to support each other, like the Mondragon Federation, okay? Mutual aid among firms is important. This federation could provide a joint voice. It could provide a skill bank where companies can bank hours of labor and trade them with each other. It could allow for labor sharing and could apply for training programs. And hopefully, with the help of the state, it could create some kind of a banking mechanism. Vermont would be first in the United States if it had some kind of a federation mechanism. Even if this mechanism was initial and preliminary, Vermont would establish some really important new territory. So in the end, I want to say to you that you are doing all of this. Your efforts are bigger than you think. You are carrying forward the idea of broad-based property ownership in American history. If you read my chapter 4, you'll see that none of these ideas were invented in Washington, and none of these ideas were invented by university researchers. They were all invented by workers and managers tinkering in their firms with this great American idea that we all are entitled to have a large enough piece of property so that we have economic and political liberty. Thank you very much.